Hey everyone, what's up? Before I begin, quick thanks to Ivan Thompson 3648 for leaving a comment mentioning BBC has a documentary on ancient Greece that also has a segment on Pankration. While searching for this documentary, I also found another small clip from a podcast hosted on BBC that mentions all ancient Greek combat sports. The host of this podcast is Greg Jenner, a historian with a bachelor's in history and archaeology and a master's in medieval studies. He has also published 4 books on various historical topics. Next, we have Shaparak Khorsandi, who is a comedian and author, though not on the topic of history. She appears to be the comedic relief of this podcast. Finally, we have Professor Michael Scott, who is a classical scholar, ancient historian, TV host, and author of 9 publications. Among other universities, he studied at Cambridge and has a PhD in classics and ancient history. He also won the Classical Association Prize in 2021 and the International Lego Classicist of the Year Award in 2022. So, will we, for the very first time, get some proper information about ancient Greek combat sports, and Pankration in particular, or will it be more of the same? Let's find out.
So we're starting with Pankration.
Finally, the correct pronunciation, although Pankration does not mean all power. All powerful or almighty is Pankratis, an epithet used for Zeus. Pankration or Pankratiastis is one who has mastered all forms of unarmed combat.
In which there are only 2 rules: don't gouge the eyes out and don't bite the other person.
This is incorrect. I've mentioned this several times across many videos, but I'll do so once again. These 2 rules come from a Roman scholar called Philostratos, who mentions them in a prose describing various pieces of art. It was not meant to be a comprehensive list of rules written out for posterity. Even if it was, the rules of ancient Hellenic and Roman Pankration differed. Some have argued that Aristophanes also mentions this supposed rule set in comedy, but again, this is by no means a comprehensive rule set, nor does he mention that it is. In fact, there is overwhelming evidence that Pankration did have rules, even more so than many modern MMA institutions, though those rules differed in their purpose. Some examples of these rules include no ground and pound, no headbutts, and of course, the match had to end when a fighter submitted by lifting the index finger or tapping. Now, I know many of you are thinking, should I really trust you over this man who has so many qualifications from some of the best, if not the best, universities and institutions? And granted, this is what most academic history boils down to. But still, if authority is what you value, everything I've mentioned about Philostratos and Pankration's rules, I've also stated in my article on the kicking techniques of Pankration that has just been published in a leading academic, peer-reviewed journal. Now, let's move on.
And then there was a bit of good old boxing. Bit of boxing, kind of vicious, like kind of one boxing match, punched the guy until his face caved in. So, who doesn't like a bit of that?
There is absolutely no ancient Hellenic text, amphora, or inscription that evokes any such occurrence. Unless he's talking about the duel between Pollux and Amycos, but that's mythology, a work of fiction that does not allude to an athletic event. Prior to the 4th century BC, boxing rules mandated the use of imantes, leather straps that wrap the hands into fists. And similar to Pankration, it appears that base knuckle strikes to the face were not allowed during this era. Only later, when the knuckles were padded, do we see rules changing and horizontal strikes appear. The padded gloves did not only change the way strikes were performed, but even how the offhand guard was held. Now, if one were to say Professor Michael Scott here only says this in a joking manner, it must be reminded that his role in the podcast is as an expert. Instead of opting for comedy at the cost of misleading the audience, it would be more appropriate to leave the joking to the comedian.
I'm going to be a bit gruesome as well, and wrestling to the death. And the first to die wins.
Well, there was no such thing as wrestling to the death. Throughout all of ancient Hellenic history, there are only 2 recorded deaths in wrestling. The first is mentioned by Hippocrates as a freak accident whereby one wrestler was killed because he fell or was slammed outside of the sandpit where wrestling matches took place, which is called the skama. The other death is written in an inscription, which does not mention how the death occurred. Such epigraphic evidence of deaths in combat sports from ancient Greece are incredibly rare, not just today, but even in ancient Rome when most of these statues still existed. But thankfully, wrestling to the death is mentioned by a comedian who is flanked on both sides by historians in a room full of masters and PhD degrees, so one would expect them to correct her on the matter. Let's see.
Okay, so, first to die usually would be the loser, but actually in the ancient Greeks Olympics, someone did die and win.
Because that means you didn't give up.
Yeah, so there we go.
Well, the first to die would not usually be the loser because the word usually implies it happened often, which it did not. The two recorded deaths in a sport that was introduced in the Olympics in the late 8th century BCE and was practiced for over half a millennium before the Romans is an almost negligible number. What he mentions about someone dying and winning is a reference to Arichion, who was a Pancratiast and not a wrestler. Arichion did win the event and did die according to an inscription which no longer exists, but how he died is unknown and most likely related to natural causes given that strangulation is ruled out. But wait, there is still hope that the LEGO award-winning classicist will correct her. Let's see.
And I think what's happening here is that none of us want to do a running race because we would have had our penises tied up with string.
No comment. Let's move on to the documentary. This is Who Were the Greeks? Again on BBC and hosted by Professor Michael Scott. I will just mention that the name of this show is bordering on the offensive, given the term were. I know many, usually in bad faith and in a racist manner, will say that the quote modern Greeks are disconnected from the ancient Greeks, even though culturally, and that the same language is spoken, languages do evolve, historically, and even genetically, according to studies, we know this not to be the case.
They had long-running feuds and bitter rivalries for power. Every man grew up knowing how to fight and was instilled with a deep desire to win.
Given what he says about these feuds and constant wars, one can see how important the truce was for the Olympic and Pan-Hellenic events and why the organizers would want to avoid brutality, injuries, and death, particularly in combat sports. In addition, different city-states had different laws regarding deaths in athletic events. Athens, for example, had a specialized court called the Delphinium that handled deaths in athletics, and these cases were not taken lightly. If athletic deaths were frequent, there would be no need for a specialized court or overrunning it with a plethora of cases from the vast number of games practiced during that epoch. Another complexity arises in regard to jurisdiction. If an Athenian were to be killed by a Theban or a Spartan, for example, would then that athlete need to be extradited to Athens for trial? All these potential complications are why the organizers of the Pan-Hellenic events would want to avoid any risks to the health of the athletes and why they designed the rules for combat sports to reflect these precautions.
Today, at the Olympic Center in Athens, there is still a legacy of one of the most brutal forms of ancient Greek combat sport.
Whenever you see the rather tacky blue and white costumes, please be aware that whatever they do is in no way associated with Pankration.
The no-holds-barred Pankration.
He went from saying it had two rules to now saying it was no holds barred. This is entirely unrealistic, especially given the fact that we have Pancratias that won 3 consecutive Olympic championships. Olympic Games take place every 4 years, and other events take place between the Olympics, like the Pythian, Nemean, Isthmian, and even Panathinaik Games. So these fighters not only competed for at least 12 years, but also trained and sparred in Pankration well into their 30s and even 40s.
Pankration is still practiced here.
Pankration is in fact not practiced here, but you'll see why soon.
When the Greeks were disarmed, when they lost their weapons, they could still fight to the death using this sport.
Pankration did not teach fighting to the death, though it would be useful in unarmed combat situations.
And he said that the Greek obsession with competition bordered on insanity.
Note the yells and the predetermined sequences, which are akin to Krav Maga and other self-defense practices. Also note the position of the offhand during the strike. This is purely a karate form, not Pankration. And I know for a fact that the teachers or masters of, quote, modern Pankration were former karate practitioners who changed their school to Pankration for either monetary or nationalistic purposes. The stance, the shouts, and even the techniques you see here are further proof of this fact.
I understand Pankration as part of the ancient world.
I'm afraid he does not understand Pankration as a part of ancient Greece, unfortunately not even on a surface level. It would have been much better if he simply admitted this fact by stating that he was not there as an expert on the topic but was willing to learn. Then he could just say he was misinformed instead of using his credentials to give legitimacy to these fraudulent practices that are being showcased around the world via the BBC. I take it the producers may have played a role in this, but there's no way to be sure.
In the ancient world, Pankration was thought of as the most difficult sport, the toughest.
Boxing was considered the toughest according to most surviving accounts of combat sports, but given that these are post-Hellenistic sources, they would need further corroboration. There is an argument that this was the case after the 4th century BCE and the introduction of the padded gloves, as we can see from the statue The Boxer at Rest.
Yes.
Almost no rules whatsoever. Is it like that today?
No, today we have rules.
The rules they have in this, quote, modern Pankration are nearly identical to karate sport competitions, with some additional grappling.
And do this move.
Simply compare his posture with an actual Pankration closed fist direct to the body. As you can see, the offhand in Pankration was held high and above the shoulders. I go into why on the article on the hand strike techniques of ancient Hellenic boxing and Pankration, which I will make a video about as soon as it's published. When I first saw this, I will readily admit I burst into a fit of laughter. But yes, this is karate with some self-defense elements mixed in, and is so far detached from Pankration that I'm afraid the only way I can describe any coaches or teachers of this practice is by using the word charlatans, and I don't say that lightly. As I note in my published article, the organization associated with, quote, modern Pankration, as displayed by the logo on the coach's jacket, was funded by the Greek government for decades and received large sums of money every year. They did absolutely nothing to research and promote Pankration other than these farcical displays of fantasy martial arts. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Culture and Sports don't even answer my emails, but my personal bitterness aside, this is an embezzlement of public funds.
All the throws and moves in modern Pankration come from the ancient sport.
Well, this statement could not be further from the truth.
So you can throw someone of any weight.
Yes.
It doesn't matter how heavy or tall they are with the move.
It's about...
As you can see from his line of questioning, he does not have any experience in combat sports, nor do most academics that write on the matter, which has further led to the spread of misinformation about Pankration. Together with referencing one another constantly without questioning their line of reasoning, misinterpreting pottery because they don't know what they're looking at, it's no wonder why misinformation about the sport has been running rampant in academic circles for over a century. Overall, this is an embarrassing display of ineffective martial arts, and it's a pity that it's shown to a wide audience by the BBC and given credibility by Professor Michael Scott's academic authority. On one hand, there is the redeeming factor that he's mostly misinformed by other academics who have written on the matter, given that he just echoes what they say. But suggesting that this charade is true to Pankration is inexcusable. He can, of course, fix this by simply coming out and admitting he was mistaken and working to dispel the misinformation that he had a part in spreading. One can only hope. And with all this being said, the Olympics are approaching, and there will be a cascade of misinformation in all types of media, especially for ancient Hellenic sports, and Pankration is going to be one of them. If you encounter this, please try to educate them on the matter, or point them to this channel. I can do my best to debunk these myths, but the reality is that without your help, only a fraction of the misinformed audience will ever reach the explanations I offer. One last thing before I go is I've received a new batch of links that lead to the full version of my article on the kicking techniques of Pankration. If you haven't read it, I've posted this link on Patreon, where you'll also find exclusive audio files and videos like the breakdown of History Channel's Human Weapon. Any and all support on Patreon helps assist me, the channel, and of course the effort of reviving Pankration. Until next time, cheers.